Welcome, everyone. You're listening to The Last Dinosaur, and I'm your host, Chris Aversano. Today's episode is our annual year in review with our very special guest, Evan Efstathiou of SkySail Advisors and CEO of Burmester and Vogel. If you are a regular listener, you know Evan has joined us for the final episode of the year for 3 years running, and he's back again for year number 4 here in 2012. We're going to unpack the stories and trends that shape maritime tech this year, revisit some predictions. Let's see if we're right, and take a look forward at what 2026 may bring. Evan, welcome to the podcast.
Chris, thanks for having me back. Great to be here.
That's fabulous. I love having you here. We love hearing what's going on. Before we get into the wrap up, you kind of wear two hats: SkySail Advisor, which does a lot of great work there in advising companies on the maritime tech space, and of course, CEO of Burmester Vogel, a company that's really, you're having to rebuild, not necessarily rebuild, but certainly take some of the strengths that B&V has and build out even more in the demurrage space. Talk a little bit about what you got going on there before we get into the general market.
Absolutely. Thanks, Chris. Well, first off, it's been a pretty busy and exciting year for maritime tech. I would say, if I wear my SkySail hat, we keep seeing a lot of investment activity in maritime tech, mergers, acquisitions, consolidation. We continue to see new faces in terms of private equity firms and venture capital and even family offices showing interest in maritime tech. I think that you've seen the strength of a number of the shipping specific funds in terms of both the investment that they do and the money that they're raising for their investors. I mean, I think, the ones that come to mind, you've seen activity with Motion Ventures out of Singapore, the Dock out of Israel, TMV in the US. Like each of those have really been successful at bringing, I would say, maritime or trading corporate venture capital closer to maritime tech, raising new funds to deploy into maritime startups and more established companies. And generally, there's been a backdrop of money coming into the market. So I think that that's been a clear trend that the growth is there. It's been a different market, I would say, than previous years. I feel like a lot of the attention and spotlight is on some of the larger players in the market. This could be because of the scale of opportunity that everyone sees around things like AI. But yes, wearing the SkySail hat, we do have a joint venture with AMA Capital, a New York-based investment bank, where we've done a couple of projects this year advising companies on acquisition and divestment of maritime tech. So really happy to continue working with our friends there. I've known AMA my entire career since my first day in shipping. So that's been great to see that relationship continue. And otherwise, we're seeing that people are taking a deeper look at some of these much bigger companies, which tend to be more involved projects. On the B&V side, I have to admit, I don't think I've ever been busier. We have been very busy with the continued rollout of our AI tools and applications that have been focused primarily on lay time and demurrage. And this year we expanded more into AI for chartering and AI for other workflows for commodity traders. So that's a project that really I would say I embarked on 4 years ago. So 4 years ago is when we started our AI development. This year, we actually finally applied for a patent application for some of the technologies that we've developed. So my colleague Wilson Zhu and I have spent a whole lot of time looking at how to take the unstructured data that you get in trading and shipping, process the documents associated with that, structure that data into something useful, and feed processes around automating the calculation of a demurrage claim, providing insights and intelligence on port delays for chartering. And then the latest work we're doing is now analyzing things such as the certificates of origin and other types of certificates relating to the actual commodity itself, comparing that with the contracts and helping people spot discrepancies that could delay issuance of bills of ladings or issuance of release of funds. So really, what's happened is as we've built one set of AI tools that work, customers are coming back and saying, can you help with these other workflows? So that's been quite exciting, but I have to admit, being stretched in a number of different directions, I always enjoy working that way, but AI really creates so many more opportunities than I think you see without AI. So it's remains to be seen what next year looks like.
Well, before we get to next year, let's talk a little bit about this year. And we're going to talk about it in the first way of you kind of hinted on it a little bit with your introduction around what's going on with SkySail, as well as your own company. But flesh out a couple of the 2 or 3 really big stories in the maritime tech space that we saw in 2025.
Back a year ago, we talked about how one of the predictions was an acceleration in AI-enabled tooling and data infrastructure. That has been, I would say, resoundingly on the dot. I think you probably can't find a company out there that hasn't tried or currently uses tools like ChatGPT. Right? So AI is something that everyone is embracing in our personal lives and professionally. Not only are people exploring the use of these tools for their day-to-day work, but organizations are quite thoughtfully spending time to assess their needs, test out solutions in the market, and assess what are the performance improvements that we can get from adopting these tools. And in certain workflows, areas where there's either manual work, repetitive work, having to search and retrieve information, having to check or compare information, these workflows are really nicely suited to being solved by AI. And I think that we're really seeing basically many of the vendors in the market are implementing AI. And then meanwhile, end users are sort of expecting it to where I think we're not very far away from seeing like AI isn't going to be the add-on to a tool. It's going to be table stakes. You have to have it as part of the solution. So customers aren't going to ask, do you have AI? They're just going to say, does your solution work? And they don't care how you get there. They want the problem solved. So I think that that's really going to start to differentiate those companies that have the AI technology, talent, and tools that their customers need.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to you fundamentally just servicing your customer's need, and we can get back to the second. But the other big story, and it wasn't major splashes, but there was a lot of mergers and companies that have been established. We talked a little bit earlier before we got going about 1 or 2 companies buying a few other companies and kind of making a bigger presence. Talk a little bit about kind of that end of it. We did see a lot of M&A and activity, as well as a little kind of unfortunate spinoff of that as well.
Well, certainly, I think that when you look at some of the bigger players in the market, we saw activity by several of the larger private equity and venture-backed companies. One of the bigger transactions, Kepler closed on their acquisition of Spire's Maritime Technologies. So they're further consolidating their position in both terrestrial and satellite AIS in providing cargo intelligence. We saw Marcura work on a flurry of acquisitions. Their most recent, I think, was Brightwell on the payment side. But they also bought Hubsea in the demurrage space, Vesselman, and even we've seen them and a few others do kind of what I would call AI acqui-hiring. In Marcura's case, they bought, I think it was a company called Shipster, where you buy up a smaller AI shop that, so you can turbocharge some of your work. We saw them do that. I think also MineHub on the metals and mining commodity side did something similar with a company called Jules AI. And then Sedna, I think maybe that's probably the biggest story is Sedna, which has been backed by Insight Partners, started doing more of the classic roll-up by buying Nordic IT and Compass Air, which were email systems. But then the bigger announcement was their acquisition of Dataloy on the voyage management side to really position more of a head-to-head with Vesen Nautical. Of all of them, I mean, Vesen was really the one that has had really high-profile acquisitions the last few years. We didn't really see that activity this year. If anything, the latest news was sort of reorganization and realigning of the company's size with some layoffs, which both Vesen and reportedly Marcura did.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be interesting because we concluded last year with relationships being an important part. And, of all the people that got laid off, how does that at all impact any sort of relationships going forward? And does that give an opening? We can get to maybe our predictions. Would that give an opening to smaller companies who have those relationships, rather than the big behemoth? And we could fleshed it out a little bit more about what we think 2026 is going to look like. But certainly from looking at the rearview mirror of 2025, those are some very, very much a hot topic. The other one, and I think tangential to this, and we picked it over, but I think it's worth mentioning, and we could maybe talk a little bit about it also in some of the things that we predicted for this year. And that's kind of like, there's always been a flurry of products around decarbonization, but now you have, the IMO hitting the brakes a little bit on behest of the US, but maybe not. I've heard some things from some owners that they were happy that the IMO slowed down and took a year off. What do you think about that? I mean, because decarbonization software was always kind of interesting.
I mean, I think it was, and I think it continues to be. What's clear to me in all the work that we've been doing looking at cargo and freight contracts, like you're seeing the ETS and things like Fuel EU clauses in charter parties, getting these types of emissions related and decarbonization related initiatives into the actual day-to-day trading and voyages. Once it's real, then everyone realizes we've got to calculate it. And the moment you got to calculate it, technology is a tool to help you reduce the time and the risk and the cost of doing that. So I think that despite a bit of the slowdown in terms of implementing very specific initiatives around when are we going to get our carbon reduced in the industry as a whole, I think the one thing that's clear is that the decarbonization technology and investment in that is here to stay. I think it's only going to continue because tech and digital is like sort of low-hanging fruit. Notwithstanding the delays at IMO, I mean, I don't think it's unreasonable to say, hey, this needs to be further thought out. The key is to see action. And so far, to me, it reminded me a bit of IMO 2020. We were talking to many of the world's biggest tanker companies just before IMO 2020. And what we found was that the moment January 1st hit, everybody mobilized. A number of people waited till the end, but at the end of the day, people move on it. So I think that's really the story around the decarbonization. Going back to your other point, anytime you see supply demand shifts or companies reorganizing, right sizing, you get interesting shakeups where talent that is very experienced or has one skill set suddenly becomes available on the market. That no doubt is going to be good for cross-pollination of ideas, maybe seeding smaller companies to try to compete with the bigger guys. So I think that's a good thing. I mean, for me, the big surprise, if I call it a surprise, is given the continued interest in maritime tech, I would think that it's hard to find people with maritime experience. So generally, I'd want to attract and retain them versus having people move around. But then again, every situation is really specific to a different company. So there's no real like generalizing like, oh, that's a good idea, that's a bad idea. It could also be that these moves signal either pressure from private equity or interest in looking at what to do next.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting, and we could talk about that in a little bit in our predictions. But before we go into this year's coming predictions, we did chat about a few things which we thought would happen. And one of the ones is, and you kind of, again, alluded to this earlier, but the fact that AI, you said something to the effect of, you gotta have real value to AI. And I think you're right. What happened in the prediction kind of definitely overlapped in the sense of you can't have an AI tool that's just like an add-on that you're going to charge more. It has to be part of solving the problem. And that was definitely your prediction. You talk about kind of how this fleshed out because you deal having the AI as part of what you're doing with BMV and then also seeing deal flow. Talk a little bit about like that idea of AI, going from this hype cycle to where the rubber hits the road.
Absolutely. It's interesting to see the spectrum of expectations people have in the market. Some have a view that, hey, my full job should be able to be end-to-end automated. That's the point at which they say the AI works. What is more pragmatic is to say, can you see clear incremental improvement where we can save you 5, 10, 20, 50%, 90% of your time on performing a certain task? And if you start adding up all these little incremental improvements, suddenly that's what changes the game. So I think that when it comes to what we're seeing, it's quite interesting in that, we had a recent example where we were asked to present how well our demurrage AI could automate a demurrage claim for a handful of different scenarios. And so we said, absolutely, send us all the documents. We'll calibrate the models. We'll run it through the engine. We'll show you how it's done manually, how it's done automated. So then I look at the first one. The first one is a ship loading in Houston, in the middle of a tropical storm. So I'm like, I see certain interruptions and exceptions that, based on the general terms and conditions of that trade, would likely be time not counting against the charter. So suddenly you see these edge cases, which, are fairly common, let's say September, October, but aren't like every year round. And so you see some exceptions. And then, you go and you discharge in Nigeria, and suddenly I see a statement of facts that's fully handwritten in cursive in like, you remember in school when you had lined paper and you had the wide ruled line and then the college ruled lines?
That's what I had, baby. Come on.
Yeah.
I had terrible handwriting. Yeah, my shift in grades came from when I was able to use a word processor. When I was able to like type stuff out, and I learned keyboarding in the 10th grade. I actually got a 17 on the final out of 100. But let me explain. I ended up passing a class with a C because I was the only one in that class that didn't cheat. Because the professor would watch. He knew I was actually trying, and everybody else was cheating, and he just gave me like a C or like a B or something. He's like, nah, man. But I got a 17. But it did change my perspective, because otherwise, if I was writing in cursive, who knows where I'd be.
Exactly. Well, so imagine getting that.
Yeah.
And it's all in cursive, college rule, and everything is mushed together, right? Oh. And you look at it and then you say, well, what am I supposed to do with this, right? So, there's certain things that even a human has difficulty with, Chris. Yeah. And now imagine AI. So when you look at, vessel, end of sea passage, anchored, NOR
tendered. Yeah.
Right? I mean, this is incomprehensible, just completely incomprehensible. And so, so you see situations like this, and rather than shy away from it and say, guys, this is impossible, or, I remember one of them we saw, it was a vessel loading in a port in France, and it's like, my team looked at it, they're like, Evan, that doesn't look like a cargo quantity. That looks like a license plate number. It had, numbers and the letter T for metric tons and then more numbers. And, but the reality is this is real life. So I think that part of it is, we use these as examples to describe the journey. But, AI is not replacing your job today. It is certainly moving rapidly. And at the same time, as we get examples like that, on the flip side, we have people who say, well, can you show me where we are recapturing revenue that we might have missed or where mistakes got spotted by the AI? And again, when I mentioned search and discovery, comparison, these are great use cases for AI. There, we've had some great examples where we could say, hey, look, vessel tendered notice before the laycan date. It just kind of got missed somewhere, but there's $10,000, right?
Right.
And that's a great example of that happened once out of 10 here. What if you have 200 voyages a year? That can really add
10%. Up. Yeah, and then 10%. And I think that goes into one of your other predictions, which is, having a product market fit being kind of, you have to solve the problem. And I think Maritime's always been pretty good, but I feel that there's been a little bit of, it's been good, but not hit the mark. I was actually talking to people about this the other day, and about a product that they undertook, and it was because they switched from something else, and something else the owners weren't happy with that product, and they're into the new product, and they're like, it's good, but. So, I still think that that's an important part, but certainly that was one of your predictions of companies having to be, really aligned on the product market fit for the end user.
And we see it even with OpenAI, right? Like they went from GPT-4 to GPT-5 and then had to dial back expectations that the incremental improvement from one version of models to the next is becoming more and more marginal with each release. So imagine that the big AI companies are now having to work harder and harder to get funding to fund the bubble, because we're absolutely in an AI bubble. Now take more traditional maritime tech companies that are also investing in AI at some point, everybody's going to look and say, okay, where's the ROI of my investment? Because it's expensive to invest in. You're asking the customers to pay more money. So everyone is now very focused on AI. So, I think that as we, hint on predictions for 2026, even if the AI bubble pops or the performance of development slows down, I think everyone is going to have to focus on building more resilient tools for actual commercial usage. Marketing gimmicks aren't going to work. Like we're going to be in the age of self-preservation, and only those technology companies that have built viable, usable products that customers pay for are going to really be the ones out there offering AI. And then they're going to be able to take market share from the ones that are slower to change or simply haven't adopted AI the right way.
Right. And I think maybe this gets into your last prediction of industry consolidation, right? We did see a little bit of industry consolidation this year. You mentioned certainly the two big players, and I guess three if you include what Marine Traffic did. And I think that was officially announced maybe at the end of last year, where they were going to buy Spire, but closed after kind of a little bit of a tumultuous period. They're closed in April, but actually finally got the final green light, I think, in later in the summer. But certainly Sedna and Marcura were a little bit of the leaders, picking off companies. I'm sure that there are others that were missing, but this was a little bit kind of in the forefront in the mind. Do you think this year was really something that we saw a lot of industry consolidation, or was this just kind of more of a natural attrition of roll-ups? What do you think this year really looked like in terms of consolidation?
This year felt like more, I would say, classic roll-up and a bit of the, call it AI acqui-hiring, picking up people, teams, assets that can move the needle a little bit on AI. The roll-ups that I'm waiting to see are, at what point do the investors behind companies like Vesa Nautical sit down with the investors behind Kepler or Sedna or Zero North or Marcura and say, does the industry want to see something bigger and bring those together? In other words, are we going to see a point where we're at the SAP versus Oracle type of tech market?
Yeah.
On the voyage management side, I hear people all the time, they're asking, we feel like we don't have enough options in voyage management system. Vesson has been the best system in the market. They're the most dominant player by far. And you kind of, when you look through the history of the development of vertical software, it is not easy to build up a position like what Vesson has built, right? That took decades to build. It's a lot of knowledge and know-how built into that. And so it's not like somebody's going to wake up and suddenly be like, oh, I'm going to build a voyage management system. And then in 18 months, we've got viable contenders. So I think that in some of those markets, even though you're hearing a lot of people saying they'd like to see more competition, what's the nature of that? I think that remains to be seen. More likely to happen, I think, is of those big, I think I named 5 names. Like, do we start to see a couple of those combinations come together?
Yeah.
That seems to be the next not logical move.
Yeah. And some of those, certainly if you look at the cycle of private equity money, right, it's 3 to 5 years. And if you just go back out and map at least 2 or 3 of them, you're in the window where the investors want their return, where the private equity managers want to hit those return numbers and plus to get the classic 2 plus 20%, right? If you don't know what that is, look that up, folks. You'll figure out a lot about what's going on in the industry. And then they move on to the next project, which may be something to do with car parts. I mean, they're agnostic on, at least the private equity firms generally are agnostic around their thesis. So it's going to be, I think this blends very nicely into this year's predictions. I mean, this year's predictions, we see a couple of these guys get together. What do you think?
Well, on the M&A side, I'm always excited when I see any M&A activity. I really feel that the work SkySail's done since 2017 has played some role in helping create awareness about the industry, and that brings capital in. And the more capital coming in means more investment in technology, more tools for the people I think of as our customers, so ship owners, charters, ship brokers, agents. Ultimately, that means that we're all helping accelerate global trade. So I kind of get excited about that. So as a net neutral, I would rather see someone spend $1 on shipping tech than on car parts tech.
Gosh.
But that being said, the other one we've seen for it'd be unfair if I say forever, but we've seen AXS Marine for the longest time. People have talked about Is that an asset that's going to come to market? Is that something that its owners are ready to sell? That's always seemed like a very interesting company among the mix of medium to bigger players. Certainly we've seen some nice moves made by Polestar. They bought Clearwater Dynamics. That business continues to grow and evolve from what it was 10, 20 years ago. So there are a couple of players that I think we're going to see continue making moves. And then I'm really waiting to see if something happens with the big five. I think we're going to see at some point their strategies. Certainly if I were to draw their strategies on a Venn diagram, there's overlap. So the question is, when does that overlap collide?
Yeah.
And then how does that play out? So I think that's the big move there. On the meatier and smaller guys, it's harder to tell what's going to play out. But certainly, if I look at just our business, like our business is growing faster than it's ever grown. And I'm busier, as I said, than I've ever been. So those are generally good signs, unless, you talk to my family, in which case they're complaining more than they ever have. And so I'm balancing being home with flying around the world and talking about AI at conferences.
One of the things that we kind of touched upon, but I think will be a continued trend, and I kind of like it because you touched on it a little bit, and that is investing in maritime. And I don't think necessarily this past year, but certainly there's been a gathering storm of VC, especially on the VC side, specific funds for the maritime space. Obviously, Motion Venture hit the $100 million mark. That's kind of a big story, I think, this year, right? They were the first ones, if I'm correct, to raise $100 million for maritime specific. You have obviously the dock, you have TMV here in the States, you have Flagship Founders, which kind of has this studio style. And then what I found really interesting, and it's been a little bit under the radar, but you have a lot of companies that have a CVC, corporate venture fund. And it's a lot of these ship owners or other types of companies that will focus on the maritime investment space. I think this year, one of my predictions is going to be they're going to be more outsized, especially when you have the smaller and more mid-size type companies or companies that need seed and pre-seed rounds. These are perfect grounds for where they would look.
I think you're right on with that.
Yeah, I think we're going to see more this year.
I feel that if you see, and we met with several of the large Japanese ship owners, all have CVC arms. We met with them over the past year and a half, and you could see that there was a very methodical approach to making small investments, seeing how each of the different general partners are approaching the market and investing. And now they're increasing their size of investment, because at the scale of businesses that they operate, all it takes is one or two really great ideas rolled out on a fleet of a couple hundred ships to have an outsized impact on the company. So I think that we're going to see that even more and more now. And everyone, I think it goes without saying, everyone is clear on the opportunity set around AI, but sussing out where it's really going to gain traction, it's something that's going to take time and effort. And so I think that because of the potential upside, most corporates we see are going to continue putting money towards their technology departments.
Yeah, and I think one of the other interesting trends that we started to see this year, and I think will continue to met out a little bit, is not only investment in software, but related hardware. There was a company out in Singapore got $32 million for a robotic hull cleaning, right? And so hull cleaning's been around forever, but going back to what we just chatted about in the corporate venture, the CVCs for these ship owners, well, if you could invest $32 million and all of a sudden have a fleet of robots go around the world and clean your hulls, that's going to relate to direct savings for your company in fuel cost, regardless of what's going on at the IMO or any place else. I've heard several CFOs of companies say, if I can reduce costs, which is good for the environment, if I can reduce fuel costs by reducing fuel spend because I'm burning less, it's not only good for the environment, which is great, but it's also good for my shareholders because I'm returning more TCE per day. And that equates to increased share prices.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I still think that there's a big market for hardware and software. Like, hardware has always been hard to deploy on ships. It's just the very nature of shipping, but the opportunity set is tremendous. And we've seen, even there's one company that we've spent some time speaking with this past year, IO Currents out of Seattle, where the guys have built really great hardware on board the vessel for gathering all the information from every one of the systems, feeding it back, and then AI-powered dashboards to show you how to monitor the fuel consumptions and other activity happening on the vessel. And that's something where, the moment you can just drop that in and roll it out very quickly and easily across the fleet and get visibility that you haven't quite had the same way, I think that you're going to see tremendous opportunity and upside.
Yeah, and the other one I think of, I go back to a recent interview I had with BAR Technologies, and they, put up hard wind sails, wind assisted ships. I think is the digital twin idea, which helps in the evolution of deploying hardware on ships, right? Because, like you said, a sail out to a ship is not an easy task, right? Usually the ship has to come to you, which means things like off hire and what have you. If you could do a lot of digital twinning ahead of time, regardless of what the hardware is, and the more accurate you can be with that digital twinning by probably using AI, not only can you prove your ROI case and increase sales, but you can also, you also have this opportunity to really look at the numbers before you go ahead and purchase.
Yes, absolutely. I think you're spot on with that.
Yeah, and that's what I think we're going to see next year. Any last thoughts there, Evan? Anything out of the blue you think is going to happen this year when you look at some of the things you see from SkySail or you hear from customers?
Yeah, I think, the thing with AI is it's moving so dramatically quickly that what's becoming clear to me is we all have to spend more time understanding how it's working and embracing it. That's one element. And then going back to, you mentioned one of my predictions last year was about how important people are in the process and trust. One of the things I've also seen as a trend is, a number of people are asking me, well, can I replace my entire claims department with AI, for example? And I still have a strong conviction that what we're going to see is smaller teams of highly trained, highly experienced people using AI tools versus certain tasks, such as in the case of chartering, fixing a vessel the way our shipbrokers do, or negotiating a demurrage claim the way demurrage analysts and trade execution teams do. Those roles aren't going to go away, but they're going to change.
Yeah.
I think it's going to be important.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a lot of using the data to make informed decisions or approvable decisions, because right now a lot of it is gut instinct. Well, not a lot of it, but it is data, it's gut instinct, and can you back it up? And I think most times you can be able to. I think also from the form of brokers and agents, there's a protective issue. I mean, you could just look no further than sanctions, right? It gives the charters and the owners a little extra comfort there, or a myriad of other issues that you could just go on. But I agree. I don't think, and I've talked to brokers about this, I don't think they're worried about the competition and the demands that are being put on them by the charters generally. And those demands are starting to change, right? And they're going to be things that not just the bigger shops can do, but the shops that react to those demands by, being able to perform better. And I think a lot of that link is going to be with technology.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think, one final point is there was an interesting Wall Street Journal article headline right around the time that I was speaking at the ASBA Cargo Conference. And the headline said, spending on AI is at epic levels. Will it ever pay off? And I think that is the question being posed to every CEO of every company out there, whether it's a commodity trader or industrial producer or ship owner. Hey, if we're going to invest in tools with AI, do these investments pay off? Just at the same time that the vendors are being asked by their investors, hey, we've invested a lot in you. Is it going to pay off? So there's going to be a very interesting shakeout that happens where everybody wants to see the payoff. And I think that 2026 is really going to be the year that we see that be a defining aspect of AI. We're well past early adoption and hype cycle, and now it's, show me the money.
Yeah, I agree 100%. Evan, as always, a great chat. I always ask this to conclude. This wasn't on our list of questions, but reading anything, you mentioned a Wall Street Journal article, reading anything interesting can be an article, can be a book, anything on your bookshelf while you're traveling around and trying to ignore the fact that your family is like, who is this guy?
Yes, I've actually been reading a book on the rise of Spotify called Mood Machine. And it's really fascinating because it talks about how in the history of creatives and artists making music, there was always this epic struggle between the record label and the artist, right? And the idea was, oh, well, maybe technology could free us. And if we have a platform where we don't have this intermediary, the record label, we can just distribute directly and capture a greater share of the value we're creating. And Spotify kind of heralded that as sort of like the place for the masses. And if you look at the evolution of Spotify and what's been possible, again, because of AI, it's that you have these algorithms that are creating playlists and defining music genres based on what people are willing to listen to, what they're listening to more. So like, are you clicking after 5 seconds to fast forward through a track? That might downrate it. Are you listening all the way through? So what's happening now is suddenly the evil empire has shifted from being the record label to actually being the algorithm, because the algorithm makes or breaks whether you make money. So now you have to make music for the algorithm, whereas before you were just making music because you're an artist. So it's a very, very interesting, a little bit of dystopian view of where AI could go wrong, in that, are we freeing ourselves from the shipbroker by having the ultimate fixing platform?
Yeah, I don't know about that, man. Yeah, well, the first time something goes wrong, like I always tell everybody, here's what I tell everybody when it comes down to this, and I know a lot of deals get done directly, and that's great. Sometimes they put a broker in, but remember, charters and owners want somebody to yell at. Plain and simple. Can't yell at an algorithm. Generally, they don't yell at each other. And I always say, if Evan, you're out with a ship, you're a ship owner, you're out with a cargo owner, and the cargo owner is upset at you because you didn't tell him you needed to get bunkers on the way in loaded with this cargo, which is a no-no, but you did it anyway because you got a good price on bunkers and you had to get out because you fixed the ship in the next voyage. The charter is not going to call and yell at you generally, unless you keep doing it. They're going to call the broker first because they know you just went out to dinner, right? So it's this whole relationship thing that we talked about last year that I think that at the end of the day, there's no way it's going to get replaced. It'll look different. Maybe there'll be certain circumstances where there'll be fewer brokers, but you see that happening already. But I don't think that. The interesting thing that I read was a recent Harvard Business Review article that I'll just talk about it, that talked about how companies will invest in a purchase of another company, say all the right things, do all the right things of the people that they purchased, and then after 6 months kind of forget about them. And you see this playing out in certain places in our industry, outside the industry, and you wonder what the logical thinking, and what they say is that the people who do the acquiring just go back to what they know, a way forward in kind of embracing what used to be maybe even a competitor. So it's an interesting read.
Absolutely. So that's I think at the end it's people matter, right? And even with all this tech and all this empowerment, it's people matter, and good people are hard to come by. And we should keep investing in our human capital while we adopt the tech. So that's really it. Four years in a row, Chris. I mean, this is
you got it, man.
We've been talking for as long as I've been building AI solutions. I just
there you go, man. There you go. Go back and listen to the first couple episodes, probably episode like 15 or something, 20. We did it, and then we did one. Yeah. So every year, Evan, thanks for coming on the podcast. As always, appreciate it. Have a great holiday season with the family, and hopefully you'll be home for a little while.
Thank you, Chris. Great being here again. Take care, and thanks to the Last Dinosaur. Bye.
Appreciate it.